All of these synovial joints consist of the same fluid-filled capsule structure that we've seen in earlier segments of this lecture. However, they differ due to the shapes of the articulating surfaces of the bones that are found within that synovial joint capsule. There are 6 types of synovial joints that we'll examine, and these synovial joints all differ because of the shapes of the bones that are within that capsule. We'll have the plane joints, the hinge joints, the pivot joints, the condylar joints, the saddle joints, and finally the ball and socket joints. So at plane joints, the articulating surfaces of the bones in that synovial joint capsule are flat, or they may be slightly curved. This allows the 2 bones at that joint to slide or glide over one another. And this motion is usually highly constrained due to the presence of a high number of ligaments that surround those particular bones. So due to their gliding nature, these plane joints are classified as non-axial joints and produce non-axial movement. So that means that the angle between the 2 bones in the joint does not change very much. Plane joints are found between the carpal bones, which are referred to as the intercarpal joints, between the tarsal bones, which are the intertarsal synovial joints, as well as the joints between the articular surfaces of the vertebrae in the vertebral column. At hinge joints, the cylinder-shaped end of one bone will articulate with the trough-shaped end of another bone, and this creates a hinge-like structure at that particular joint that functions in much the same way that a door hinge does. Hinge joints permit angular movements, that is, changes in angle along a single axis, and so therefore these are typically classified as uniaxial joints. The elbow joint, that is the joint that's found between the humerus and the ulna specifically, is an excellent example of a hinge joint, as are the knee joints, which are found between the femur and the tibia bones. So at pivot joints, a rounded portion of bone is enclosed within a ring-shaped structure that is formed partially by the articulation with another bone, and part of that ring structure is due to the presence of a ligament that is there. The rounded portion of bone is then capable of rotating or pivoting about its long axis, and this motion also occurs around a single plane. Therefore, that makes these uniaxial synovial joints. The joint between the proximal radius and ulna, so that is the joint that's found between the radius and the ulna at the elbow, is what allows for the radius to rotate over the ulna during that pronation movement. Another example is the joint between the first cervical vertebra, which is called the atlas, and the second cervical vertebra, which is called the axis. And it allows us to laterally rotate our head from side to side. The condylar, or also called condyloid joints, are the first of our biaxial synovial joints. One bone at the joint has a rounded surface, while the other bone has a small, sort of cup-like depression in it. The knuckle joints between the metacarpal and the proximal phalanx of each digit is a really good representative condylar joint. It allows the knuckle to move in 2 planes. So if you fan your fingers apart, that is movement in one plane, and then flex and extend your fingers toward or away from your palm, represents the second plane. The saddle joint has a biaxial as well as a multiaxial example. The joint itself consists of a saddle-shaped bone, and then another bone that resembles the legs of someone sitting in that saddle. This allows the bones to fit together like a rider sitting on a horse's saddle. An example of a biaxial saddle joint is the joint between the trapezium and the first metacarpal, and this joint permits the opposition movement of the thumb, as well as the abduction and adduction of the thumb. The sternoclavicular joint, that is where the manubrium of the sternum meets the clavicle is a saddle joint that is capable of multi-axial or triaxial movement. So at this joint, the clavicle is capable of moving superiorly and inferiorly, so that's the first plane of movement, anteriorly and posteriorly, that's the second plane of movement, and then medially and laterally, which is the third plane of movement. So finally, the ball and socket joints in the body are all capable of multi-axial movement. There are two ball and socket joints in the human body. The first is the glenohumeral joint at the shoulder, where the humerus meets the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And the second ball and socket joint is at the coxal joint, which is also called the hip joint. And this is where the head of the femur fits into the acetabulum on the hip bones. The proximal end of the humerus, as well as the femur, have a spherical-shaped piece of bone, which then fits into a very deep socket on either the scapula or on the hip bone, respectively. The acetabulum on the hip bone is very deep, and it secures the head of the femur within it. And this is extremely important for the stability of the hip joint, because remember that the hip has to transmit the weight of the body to the lower limbs. And because of that, the hip joint is much less mobile than the shoulder joint is. And so therefore, at the hip joint, we have to sacrifice some mobility for greater stability. The shoulder joint is capable of a greater range of motion because the socket that's made by the glenoid cavity on the scapula is much more shallow. And also, since the shoulder is not a weight-bearing joint, some stability at that joint can be sacrificed for greater mobility.